EMDR. If you haven't heard of it, it's currently riding high as one of the most popular and rapidly growing forms of therapy in the United States.
Harry is seen undergoing a form of therapy known as
EMDR,
which is eye movement
desensitization and reprocessing.
which amazing was the most healing. I was so scared to do it.
It's gotten huge traction as the go-to treatment for PTSD, and therapists are using it to address various other issues. Now, as a licensed therapist myself, always eager to broaden my skill set, you might think that I'd be interested in getting trained in EMDR, right? Well, no. Because here's the thing. I've got some serious reservations about EMDR, to the point that I kind of view it as pseudoscience. And I'm not the only one. You see, in addition to being super popular, it's also probably one of the most controversial and polarizing therapies in the field right now. But hold off on the pitchforks, I'm not shutting the door just yet. I still need to literally do my research and write the rest of this video before making the final call. And I'm open to being proven wrong. In fact, I'm kind of expecting it. But to know, I've got to dig deep into this technique to wrap my head around it. So, if you're into that kind of thing, or if you're one of those rare unicorns who clicks on a random video about a topic you've never heard of, stick around. This video is sponsored by Nebula. If you're unfamiliar with what EMDR is exactly, here's the highly simplistic version, though I'll go into more depth later on. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So right off the bat, it's pretty obvious why it gets shortened into an acronym. And it's a form of psychotherapy that primarily treats trauma in people and helps them overcome the negative emotions that are attached to traumatic memories through the use of eye movements. Now, if that sounds like bullshit, well, that's what I thought too. Back in the day, I can recall a mildly embarrassing conversation that I had with a friend's mom who was a seasoned psychologist, and I just finished my grad program and we were talking about her private practice or something like that. And she mentioned that she uses EMDR primarily. And I said something along the lines of, I thought that EMDR was like disproven, because the evidence is so weak. And she very kindly said, no, it's an effective treatment. And I said, oh, okay, and immediately changed the subject. I've been highly skeptical of EMDR since the moment I first learned about it. But also, that opinion is based on evidence that's at least a decade old. And I haven't tried too hard to look into it since then because, quite frankly, it just hasn't mattered to me all that much. That's changed though, because now I've had coworkers who I respect who've been trained in it, who talk about its effectiveness. I've had clients who have received EMDR or who are interested in receiving EMDR. I keep getting mailers from professional counseling organizations that are trying to get me to pay a bunch of money to get trained in EMDR. I mean, if you're in this field, it feels like it's everywhere now. So where did it even come from? Well, to understand EMDR, I think it's important to understand its founder, Francine Shapiro. Born in Brooklyn in 1948, Francine Shapiro was described as an intellectually curious person. As a young adult, her education was not in psychology as you might expect, but instead she obtained her bachelor's degree in English literature and later pursued her PhD in literature at New York University. However, 3 years into her program, at age 30, Francine was diagnosed with breast cancer. She went through chemo and radiation treatments, and luckily, the cancer went into remission. But being confronted by her own mortality, Francine made a dramatic shift in her life. She quit her PhD, sold her belongings, bought an old Volkswagen camper van, and traveled to the West Coast, living something of a hippie lifestyle. In her own words,
I took every alternative workshop I could find.
She became intensely interested in health, and she dabbled in everything: meditation, hypnosis, non-traditional treatments, new age theories. From my outside perspective, it kind of seems like she was trying to find the answers to how she could heal, both mentally and spiritually, from her cancer experience. She once said that the message coming through to me was that cancer was a stress disease. And she thought, therefore, that if she could care well enough for her mind, then perhaps she could prevent the return of her cancer. She eventually set down roots in San Diego, where I used to live, funny enough, and opened a nonprofit organization called the Human Development Institute, where she started to give her own equally alternative self-help workshops. She combined elements of, all the different things that she learned from others that she thought worked. So this included hosting motivational speakers like Tony Robbins and staging firewalks as a way of getting people to conquer their fears. A few years later, in 1982, her interest in the mind and in health led her to enroll in a clinical psychology doctoral program at the Professional School of Psychological Studies, where she took interest in the new field of psychoneuroimmunology, which explores the interaction between emotional stress and physical disease. Now, it's worth mentioning that the Professional School of Psychological Studies was an unaccredited school, and it was considered a diploma mill because they essentially sold college degrees without requiring much academic work. It actually permanently closed in 1991, only 3 years after Francine obtained her PhD in 1988 at the age of 40. Regardless, you can't deny that Francine Shapiro was a force to be reckoned with. I mean, for what I've read from the people who knew her best, and for what I've seen in the interviews that I've watched, she was intense. I mean, small talk, not her style. She was laser focused on her work, traveling 30 weeks out of the year to conduct trainings and seminars so that she could spread the word about her new therapeutic approach, EMDR. But she was also, personable and compelling, and I like listening to her talk. And I'm sure that drew people in. I mean, it's no wonder that she cultivated such a fiercely loyal following. We'll get to them later on. Francine Shapiro passed away in 2019 at the age of 71, but not before seeing the reach of her work. Today, it's estimated that there's over 100,000 therapists who have treated more than 7 million people using EMDR. That's quite an empire. And it aligns with what she saw as her purpose. See, after going through her own personal suffering, Francine Shapiro's life mission became to end the world's suffering. And she believed that EMDR was the answer. But I went a little too far. So let's rewind and delve into the origins of EMDR. And for that, we might as well quote Francine Shapiro directly from her book.
The seed of EMDR sprouted one sunny afternoon in 1987 when I took a break to ramble around a small lake. It was spring. Ducks were paddling by, and bright blankets full of mothers and babies were laid out on wide green lawns. As I walked along, an odd thing happened. I had been thinking about something disturbing. I don't even remember what it was, just one of those nagging negative thoughts that the mind keeps chewing over without digesting until we forcibly stop it. The odd thing was that my nagging thought had disappeared on its own. When I brought it back to mind, I found that its negative emotional charge was gone. I noticed that when a disturbing thought entered my mind, my eyes spontaneously started moving back and forth. They were making rapid, repetitive movements on a diagonal from lower left to upper right. At the same time, I noticed that my disturbing thought had shifted from consciousness, and when I brought it back to mind, it no longer bothered me as much. I was intrigued. I tried doing it deliberately. I thought about something else that was causing me mild anxiety, and this time I did the rapid eye movements intentionally. That thought went away too, and when I brought it back, its negative emotional charge was gone.
This eye movement that Francine Shapiro describes ends up being the basis of EMDR. After this serendipitous day, Shapiro experimented with the eye technique on both her friends and clients. She had them focus on her moving index finger in a diagonal left to right motion while they recalled negative thoughts. Now, according to Shapiro, they felt better afterward, and that was enough for her to turn this tool into a larger therapeutic technique. And her PhD dissertation topic. This dissertation work ended up being turned into an article in the Journal of Traumatic Stress in 1989. I read it, and it's messy. In it, Shapiro describes using her new technique, eye movement desensitization, or EMD. She hadn't added the R yet. Shapiro conducted an experiment comparing a control group with a treatment group. Each individual received a single 50-minute session. Half of the participants received the EMD technique, while the other half underwent a method called flooding to process traumatic thoughts. She then conducted a follow-up at 1 month and at 3 months to assess the outcomes. However, there were some notable limitations in the study. First off, the age of participants ranged from 11 years old to 53 years old, which is a huge range. There were only 22 people in the study total, which is a tiny sample, and 5 of them were other mental health professionals who were not diagnosed with PTSD. Shapiro's questioning techniques might have induced expected responses from the volunteers. And the single session approach raises questions about how much of an impact the intervention can have with such a limited time. Additionally, the control group received the EMD treatment immediately after the flooding treatment, which makes it impossible to draw any meaningful conclusions about the long-term efficacy of EMD. Looking at Shapiro's discussion section, it's obvious that she downplays the study's limitations while exaggerating its implications. I mean, I honestly encourage you to go read the original study because it starts off so promising, but ends so poorly. But hey, it was the 80s. Psychology wasn't exactly as rigorous as it is today. Francine was fairly new to research too, and EMDR now looks quite different from the early days as EMD. These days, EMDR is a totally different ball game. If your therapist is trained in this technique, they'll take you through 8 phases. The whole process usually spans about 6 to 12 sessions, each lasting 60 to 90 minutes, and as you can imagine, the actual number of sessions and duration varies from person to person. The first phase is history taking, and this is pretty straightforward. The therapist collects information about the client's past, about any traumas that they've been through, and what challenges they're facing now. This sets the stage for creating a treatment plan to reach identified goals of therapy. Then you move on to the second phase, preparation. This is where the therapist and client build a more trusting relationship, set expectations for treatment, and the therapist explains the EMDR therapy process. Now, this includes teaching the client about bilateral stimulation, which can include the eye movement that we heard about before. But it can also include other things like alternating taps on the right or left side of the body, sort of like this.
As you go with it, I want you to tap back and forth.
Okay.
Okay?
That?
Yes.
Or it can include vibrating pads held in the hand that alternate from left hand to right hand. Or it can include alternating tones from left ear to right ear. Additionally, the therapist teaches the client coping techniques like breathing exercises or meditation to deal with any emotional disturbance that might come up in the process of EMDR. Things like panic symptoms or dissociation. The third phase is assessment. In this phase, the so-called target event, or the trauma that the client would like to reprocess, is identified. Now, beyond simply pinpointing the event, the client's also asked to identify any images, beliefs, feelings, or sensations that accompany that event. The therapist also helps the client come up with a positive belief about themselves that directly contradicts a negative belief that they currently hold as a result of the trauma. Then, the therapist asks 2 questions to collect baseline measurements before EMDR treatment begins. First, the subjective units of disturbance scale, which asks clients to rate how much the memory of the target event disturbs them on a scale from 0 to 10, and the validity of cognition scale, which asks clients to rate how true that positive belief that they identified feels on a scale from 1 to 7. The next phase, called desensitization, is truly the meat of what makes EMDR unique. To start, the therapist asks the client to focus on the most visceral aspect of the trauma that they experienced, whether that be an image, a sound, a smell, or some other sensory aspect. As they hold that thought in their mind, this is when the therapist incorporates bilateral stimulation, the side-to-side eye movements, body taps, or alternating sounds that I described before. So the therapist asks the client to think about the trauma, and then for 30 to 60 seconds, they're quiet while engaging in this bilateral stimulation.
Take a deep breath.
After those 30 to 60 seconds, the therapist tells the client to take a deep breath, asks what thoughts or emotions came up for them, might provide empathy or challenge certain thoughts, and again asks the client how much the memory of the trauma disturbs them on a scale from 0 to 10. This process is then repeated over and over again until the client says that they rate the trauma disturbance as a 0. Once desensitization is complete, they move on to the next phase, installation, which entails the client taking that positive belief that they identified before and attempting to associate it with the trauma until it feels completely true. So the client is asked to hold now both the traumatic event and the positive belief in their mind at the same time, while the therapist again engages in bilateral stimulation cycles. Then the therapist asks the client to rate how true they feel that positive belief is on a scale from 1 to 7. They continue the bilateral stimulation until the client gives the answer of 7, which means that they fully embrace this positive belief about themselves. Now, it's worth noting that EMDR providers commonly incorporate other therapeutic elements at this point, like skill building, challenging cognitive distortions, and restructuring thoughts in this phase in order to assist clients in getting to that ultimate goal, the 7. The 6th phase is the body scan, and this is where the therapist again asks the client to hold in mind both the target event or the trauma and the positive belief, while now mentally scanning their body from head to toe. If there are any lingering disturbances from the body, then those feelings get reprocessed. Now, the last 2 phases actually happen over most sessions. Phase 7 is closure, and this is how every session ends. This is where the therapist helps the client return to a feeling of calm so that they're not just left in a vulnerable or dissatisfied or unsafe state. And phase 8 is reevaluation, which is how every new session begins, at least after reprocessing. So during this phase, the client and therapist discuss the recently processed memories to make sure that the client's not too distressed, that their distress levels are low, and that their positive mindset is still strong. But it also serves as a way to sort of pick up where you left off. It's sort of a way to refocus treatment at the start. Ultimately, treatment is complete when a client reports 0 level of disturbance from the trauma, and they rank the positive belief as a 7, meaning it feels completely true. So hopefully that gives a fairly clear picture of what this kind of therapy entails. If you're really interested in seeing a sample session, then I'll try to link to a few of them in the Google Doc that has all of my sources. EMDR really came about at an opportune moment, when there was something of a vacuum in treatment methods for PTSD. I mean, Francine Shapiro invented it only 7 years after the diagnosis of PTSD was first listed in the DSM. And it was marketed as a fast treatment, claiming huge results after only 1 to 4 sessions for 80 to 90% of cases. That's pretty alluring. Almost sounds too good to be true. So rather than relying on the claims of the founder herself, let's look at the research. And luckily, there's a lot of it. For my purposes, I'm opting to focus on meta-analyses rather than individual studies. I think that this approach makes it easy to see broader patterns, and it also builds confidence in the findings if it's suggested over larger groups of studies. So hopefully you agree, but let's cut to the chase. Does EMDR work? Yes. I looked at as many meta-analyses as I could find going back the past decade, and regardless of which one you look at, evidence points to EMDR being more effective than no treatment and more effective than simple supportive listening. It reliably reduces symptoms of trauma as well as symptoms of depression, anxiety, and distress related to PTSD. There's also some preliminary evidence that EMDR could also be effective for treating non-PTSD related depression and anxiety, though more research is needed. So there you have it. Case closed. Wrap it up. End of discussion. Right? Well, not exactly. I want to put a really big asterisk here because there are some serious caveats to keep in mind. For example, pretty much every meta-analysis that I read highlighted that most of the studies they included had a high risk of researcher bias, meaning that researchers may favor particular results, which impacts how they conduct the study or analyze the data. Now, researcher bias is not that uncommon in scientific studies in general. I made a whole video about publication bias and p-hacking in this video up here, but it is surprising that the risk of bias in these studies is so obvious to outside observers. A renowned meta-analysis from 2020 stated that only 13 of the 76 EMDR studies that they looked at had a low risk of bias, which is wild. Another common trait was that nearly every analysis pointed out that the studies they analyzed were, by and large, low quality. This might be due to flawed methodology, design, or execution, but that further casts doubt on the reliability of these results. A recent 2022 meta-analysis indicates that the efficacy of EMDR treatment increased with more sessions that are longer than 60 minutes, and with experienced therapists. Now, that might not sound surprising, but it contradicts the notion that EMDR is a short-term treatment format, and it attributes a lot of the outcome to therapist skill rather than EMDR techniques. So, does that mean that we can't trust the data? No. Despite the caveats, I actually do believe that there's enough credible evidence to suggest that EMDR is effective for treating trauma-related issues. The American Psychological Association has listed EMDR as an evidence-based practice for PTSD treatment. Though not as strong of an endorsement as several other trauma therapies, but it isn't a complete picture without some additional considerations. First off, in that 2020 meta-analysis that I mentioned before, EMDR was shown to be more effective than other therapies, except in all the studies that had a low risk of researcher bias. But nonetheless, EMDR generally seems as effective as cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which is sort of the gold standard for evidence-based therapy. It also appears as effective as trauma-focused CBT for treating chronic PTSD in adults, but less effective than trauma-focused CBT with children and adolescents. Additionally, EMDR does not outperform other exposure-based treatments that are commonly used for PTSD or anxiety disorders. And notably, EMDR has shown inconsistent effectiveness in treating combat-related PTSD. Now that's worth examining in more detail because that distinction is not typically found in most other trauma-specific treatments. It's worth noting here that there's very little evidence supporting EMDR's effectiveness in treating anything other than PTSD because there simply isn't enough high-quality research. And lastly, there's very little evidence demonstrating that EMDR treatment significantly reduces PTSD-related symptoms long-term, particularly after 3 months. So over the long term, evidence suggests that EMDR performs significantly worse compared to other therapies like exposure-based therapies or CBT. That's concerning. If you pay for treatment to process past trauma, I think you'd want it to stick, Maybe that's just me. All of these questions about EMDR's effectiveness and limitations lead me to a more fundamental question about it, which is, what the heck is the point of the eye movements? The eye movement is literally the thing that makes EMDR EMDR. When Francine Shapiro told her story about discovering EMDR, it was in the context of her eyes darting diagonally and how that helped her process her memories. She used eye movements in the studies she conducted as the basis for this therapy. I mean, it's literally in the name: eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. So what's it doing? No one knows, not even Francine Shapiro. To this day, there is no unified theory of what eye movement does, though that hasn't stopped a whole bunch of folks from coming up with a whole host of explanations. Some say that it acts as a distraction that's not meant to be too mentally taxing so that it requires your total focus, but just enough to make the traumatic memories you're thinking of less intense because your working memory can't focus on them completely. Others say that it's relaxing. By doing this repetitive rhythmic task, it puts your mind and body into a calmer state, and that helps you process the trauma more easily. Some claim that it synchronizes the brain's left and right hemispheres, which promotes communication and integration between the hemispheres, which somehow allows better processing of the traumatic memories. And some say that the bilateral stimulation enables dual attention, meaning that it keeps you, in the present, but also in the past. Another fun theory is that the way that our eyes move during the process triggers an evolutionary orienting response that's used to scan the environment for threats. And still others, including Francine Shapiro, postulate that the eye movement simulates REM sleep, which is the sleep stage that our eyes flick around as we process memories. Any of those sounds within the realm of possibility. There are a few that are maybe more interesting or realistic than others, particularly the last one since it had the backing of the founder herself. But confusingly, as we discussed earlier, EMDR can be done using many different kinds of bilateral stimulation, not just eye movements. So tying it to REM sleep or scanning the environment for threats seems a bit of a stretch. In fact, while exploring why exactly she expanded the treatment from just eye movement to any kind of bilateral stimulation, Francine Shapiro stated,
Eye movement is the first thing I discovered, but it's not the only thing. Something other than that may be able to stimulate the information processing system.
Maybe, but maybe not. I mean, this seems like a pretty casual approach to the defining feature of the therapy. But at the end of the day, I don't need to know why the eye movements or bilateral stimulations work. But I do find it incredibly important to know that they do work. So, do they work? Well, it's far from a settled topic, but right now, the research seems to be saying no. Remember that huge meta-analysis from 2020 that I mentioned a few times before? Well, I'm going to talk about it again. So, of the 76 studies it analyzed, 10 of them studied treatment outcomes for clients who received EMDR with bilateral stimulation and clients who received EMDR without bilateral stimulation. In every single study, it found that there was no significant difference. That meta-analysis was led by the same researcher who almost a decade earlier had co-written a different meta-analysis that seemed to indicate that bilateral stimulation did make a difference. Though it's worth noting that 23 of the 24 studies from that analysis were at high risk of bias, and his co-author might have been prone to researcher bias himself due to the fact that he operates a business as an EMDR trainer. That prior meta-analysis also received the equivalent of a diss track in the research world from a few of their colleagues in the field, so. But all this stuff that I'm bringing up really isn't that new. Controversy has followed EMDR since its inception. People have always questioned the eye movements and whether they really work. But the controversy doesn't stop there. There's been a lot of questions swirling around EMDR as an institution. And unsurprisingly, most of it begins with Francine Shapiro. When I gave a brief overview of Francine's life, I breezed over some details that I think are relevant to bring up now. The story that Francine gives about how she discovered the basis of EMDR, her walk in the park, it's a nice story. However, if you look at it a little closer, you start to have some questions. For example, Francine claimed that while thinking about her negative memory, she noticed it became less disturbing and only later realized her saccadic eye movements, which she identified as possibly helping her get better. Saccades are part of everyday life. As you're watching this video, you might perceive yourself as having a fixed gaze on one point, such as my face. But the reality is that your eyes are constantly darting around, switching between points of focus. This is involuntary, and it helps you build up a mental three-dimensional map. Another place where this happens constantly is while you're reading. Your eyes shift from one word to the next, and then quickly refocus. But the thing is, research has shown that saccades are considered physiologically invisible. You don't notice them as they happen. When you watch this video, or walk through the park, or read a book, your vision feels fluid rather than feeling like your eyes are darting from one point to another. So the idea that Francine actually felt these involuntary movements, it's kind of ridiculous. But if that's true, then why tell the story? Well, I think it serves a dual role. First, it sort of creates this mythical aura around this new, innovative creation. It came to her on a whim and she just plucked it out of the air because she's simply that attuned to herself, right? Businesses and famous people, they do this all the time. They cook up some cool origin story. But there's a second motive at play here. It conveniently obscures her sources and connections that influenced and inspired the development of EMDR. When I first started diving into Francine Shapiro's past, I thought that I'd find out that she was inspired by hypnosis because the eye movement kind of reminded me of a hypnotist swinging a watch back and forth. Speaking of which, if hypnosis, I think that would be a pretty cool video idea. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd want to see. In any case, it turns out that EMDR has almost nothing to do with hypnosis. But the truth is far more concerning. Because the truth is that Francine Shapiro was heavily invested in neuro-linguistic programming. After her cancer diagnosis, when she finally settled down in San Diego, I mentioned that she opened an organization called the Human Development Institute, which specifically gave weekend workshops and 8-week trainings in neuro-linguistic programming. For the uninitiated, neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP, is a pseudoscience. I'm not going to go into too much depth here because otherwise we'll be here all day, though again it might make an interesting video idea, comment below. But it's a psychological framework that believes that by changing the way that we think or talk, we can influence our behavior and achieve desired outcomes in various aspects of life. So, for example, it proposes that if you just model the strategies and thought patterns of superachievers, then you could achieve similar success. The founders also claimed that it could be used to treat phobias, depression, nearsightedness, allergies, and the common cold in a single session. It also promoted some pretty wacky concepts, like the idea that certain linguistic patterns can be used to influence or manipulate others. It also claimed that eye movements can reveal a person's thoughts. Aha! Eye movements. Yeah, you might have even heard some of these eye-related theories that came out of NLP, such as the idea that if someone's looking up and to the left while they're talking to you, it means that they're lying. What this means is that after exploring every alternative treatment out there, Francine Shapiro founded an organization to promote this unscientific gobbledygook. And it undoubtedly inspired EMDR. In 1985, Francine published an article in Holistic Life magazine. The following snippet appeared in that article.
One of the findings of the neuro-linguistic programming research is that all people, cross-culturally, with the exception of the Basque nationality, show how they are thinking by the way their eyes move. Even without their saying a word, if you watch their eyes carefully, you can determine whether they are seeing a picture, hearing, or feeling something. As a further refinement, you can tell if they are remembering something or constructing it. Thousands have learned to walk on red-hot coals without injury using neurolinguistic programming. Using neurolinguistic programming, people are shown how to tap into their own unlimited source of personal power, get rid of even the basic fear of fire, and change their physiology to walk across the coals. The major dilemma that people are confronted with in neurolinguistic programming is the question of manipulation and free will. Since the powerful technology allows you to practically read minds and have people respond automatically in any way you choose, there is a distinct ethical issue.
To be clear, she was a fourth-year PhD student at this point, and this was only 2 years before her fateful walk in the park. Now, I don't want to harp on this too much, but I do think that it's important to know where certain ideas come from and how history shapes a person's perceptions. By the time Francine needed to come up with a dissertation idea, research was starting to look unfavorably at NLP. With the writing on the wall, it makes sense that she'd want to free herself from its souring reputation and instead create something totally new that she had full control of. Sort of like how I freed myself from YouTube and started making totally new videos that I have control over. Now listen, I'm just a small fish in a very large pond, and it's hard to be a creator on YouTube. The pay is unfair, you gotta serve the almighty algorithm, and there's a lot of video topics and ideas that I simply cannot post here. So me and a few of my other creator friends made a streaming service called Nebula, where we don't have to worry about any of that. That's how Broe Deschanel has made a video examining sex scenes in films, how Real Life Lore can put out an hour-long documentary on the Israel-Hamas war, how Philosophy Tube made an entire frickin' award-winning play. And it's also why I'm able to post silly, lightweight videos like this one where I react to therapy TikToks.
Your therapist knows what's wrong with you, and they're never gonna tell you.
The point is not for a therapist to tell a client what's wrong with them. The point is for the client to be able to do that self-discovery and sort of figure it out for themselves, because that is actually going to be way more successful and have long-lasting effects.
I have so many talented friends here making stuff that you just can't find on YouTube, like Lindsay Ellis, Real Engineering, City Beautiful, and so many more. In fact, my totally real and not biased research says that subscribers feel twice as happy because they get to watch a ton of new videos from me and others and support me at the same time with their dollars. Well, that seems rock solid, and thanks to the current Nebula subscribers, I can actually afford EMDR training now. I'm kidding about the EMDR part. I am very thankful though. So, if you want to watch every single one of my new videos ad-free, plus extended and exclusive videos that we don't put anywhere else, plus experimental videos by many of the best creators out there, then sign up using the link below. That'll support me directly and get you 40% off the annual plan, which is as little as $2.50 a month. And if you hate monthly fees, for a limited time, Nebula is offering a lifetime membership for $300. You pay once, and you get Nebula for as long as Nebula and you exist. That sounds like a threat, but it's not. And if you're looking for a Christmas gift for a friend or a loved one, they've got gift cards too. But seriously, I wish that this was an option at more streaming services, and I'm really glad that we offer it. So whatever you end up doing, I look forward to seeing your objective happiness levels skyrocket. So go check out nebula.tv/neurotransmissions to see all of our videos right now and to support the channel at the same time. Thanks, y'all. All right, let's get back to it. What we can say for sure is that Francine had an entrepreneurial spirit. She founded multiple businesses before finally striking gold when she founded EMDR Institute, Inc. And I mean it when I say gold. I mean, from the beginning, EMDR has been an expensive therapy to get trained in. In order to be considered certified in EMDR, you have to complete 2 separate trainings for a total of 40 hours, and that'll cost you $1,500. And that's just the minimum. That doesn't include any supplementary seminars. That feels almost exploitative. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've seen more expensive trainings, but for comparison, the cost of other trainings in trauma-focused techniques is usually in the $200 to $600 range. Part of why it's remained so expensive is because Francine held strict proprietary control over who was allowed to train others in EMDR. Shapiro required trainees to sign a consent form stating that because EMDR is so powerful and could be dangerous in the wrong hands, they agreed that they would not teach others how to perform the technique. Meanwhile, some therapists report being recruited while at the training to become consultants or trainers themselves, which kind of gives bad pyramid scheme vibes. This really seems just antithetical to the profession in therapy. I mean, we value disseminating new treatments quickly and accessibly in order to help people, but I honestly feel like this isn't inspired by a cash grab necessarily. I feel like this need for control originates from a place of fear. When EMDR first came on the scene in 1989, Francine Shapiro said that you could learn it from her written instructions. In the 90s, several early studies compared EMDR with eye movement versus without, and found no difference between the two. In response, Francine argued that the researchers hadn't received the proper training and needed to be level 1 trained to make it work. Fair enough, but then when researchers did that and still got null results in their controlled studies, Shapiro then moved the goalposts again by saying that actually it was mandatory to receive level 2 training in order to be fully certified. She claimed that level 2 training was necessary because it yielded better results than level 1, even though there's no evidence that formal EMDR training is necessary at all in order to administer it, much less level 2. But fine. Then the researchers got level 2 training and conducted a study in which one group got EMDR with eye movements, and one group got EMDR but replaced the eye movements with finger tapping. By the time they published their research showing no differences between groups, Shapiro had already broadened her claims, saying alternate forms of bilateral stimulation could work just as well as eye movements. I bring that up because things like this end up happening a lot. When confronted by conflicting or contradictory evidence, Shapiro points to other publications that show EMDR's effectiveness and places blame on clinicians for not doing it right, rather than examining the methods or practice itself. But don't take my word for it. She said that clinicians should expect an 80 to 90% success rate, and
if this level of success is not achieved, the clinician should take responsibility for becoming more skilled in the method.
And so whether purposeful or not, Francine Shapiro has created a very insular institution where challenges or doubts are waved away and non-believers are shunned. This results in a pretty weird culture around EMDR. People who practice EMDR get really into it, like with MLMs or CrossFit. There's an almost cult-like vibe around the technique that makes me super uncomfortable. Now, I'm speaking in generalities, of course, but this is a common experience for both me and others in my field. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. I mean, the cost of training is high, so you're probably not going to pursue it unless you already have a significant interest in it. And then once you attend, you're essentially bought into the approach, which ends up breeding this strange degree of loyalty and blind faith in EMDR. So rather than producing better trained clinicians, it's pumping out scientifically uncritical fanatics. Maybe you think that sounds like hyperbole, but there are some serious real-life implications. First off, it's worth mentioning that although it's only shown compelling evidence for treating PTSD, EMDR has an extensive history of marketing itself in advertising and in trainings as a treatment for any issue you can think of. This leads clinicians to view it as this one-size-fits-all magic bullet. Eating disorder? EMDR. ADHD? EMDR. Schizophrenia? EMDR. Just want to reach your full potential? EMDR. You can't do that. You don't have the evidence to substantiate it. It's unethical. I think we should all be wary of anything that claims to be a panacea, like neuro-linguistic programming, for example. I get it. You might hear a lot of stories from people about how EMDR was essentially a miracle cure for them. But that doesn't mean that therefore we should accept it whole cloth, or that therefore it can be used to treat everyone or everything. And second, as we saw earlier while exploring its efficacy, this fanaticism might have an impact on research itself. Since there are significant barriers to accessing EMDR training, that means that research on EMDR and its effectiveness is more likely to be conducted by those who have a vested interest in the technique, which significantly increases the opportunity for researcher bias. And based on the meta-analyses I read, that's a pretty big issue. But listen, EMDR is not a cult. It's not some malevolent institution that's purposefully deceiving people. I actually think that Francine Shapiro wholeheartedly believed in EMDR. And look, the bottom line is that EMDR clearly has merits. It's shown to be effective in treating PTSD, and it could prove to be effective for treating a lot of other issues. But I guess the way that I view EMDR now is as a purple hat therapy. Let me explain with a story. Once upon a time, in a quaint little town, a sophisticated city man named Jarvis strolls in, presenting himself as a miraculous healer. As curiosity spreads, he assembles a captivated audience and seeks volunteers for his groundbreaking treatment. An elderly woman, grappling with persistent back pain, eagerly raises her hand. Mr. Jarvis confidently asserts, "Follow my instructions, and your pain will vanish in no time." With a flourish, he opens his briefcase to unveil a majestic purple hat. "With this potent hat upon your head, stretch for an hour each day, and its magical powers will work wonders on your ailment." Intrigued, the old woman complies, and true to Mr. Jarvis's promise, her back pain dissipates. Word quickly spreads, and soon the entire town wants their own purple hat, convinced that this enchanted accessory holds the key to curing all of their woes. In this situation I made up, the purple hat was doing essentially nothing except, being used as a sales gimmick. The real hero was the hour of stretching that took care of that pesky back pain. This false cause fallacy leads you to assume that just because two things happen at the same time, one must be causing the other. We can apply this analogy to explain EMDR. Many critics, myself included, believe that EMDR takes well-established strategies and techniques of exposure therapy and CBT, which do have a solid track record in treating PTSD and anxiety disorders, and throws in bilateral stimulation as a sort of quirky extra, making it seem like it's something new and groundbreaking. Most of the EMDR procedure is borrowed from other therapies, taking a client's history, developing treatment plans, building a therapeutic bond, setting treatment expectations, and measuring progress using questionnaires. These are all fundamental to so many treatments. When clients are asked to vividly recall past traumas and explore their emotional and physiological responses to those memories, those are techniques commonly employed in exposure therapies. When clients replace their negative thoughts and beliefs with more supportive and positive beliefs, that's a fundamental part of CBT. It's called cognitive reprocessing. These are the elements that are likely doing all of the heavy lifting in EMDR, not the bilateral stimulation. The name itself, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, pays homage to another method called systematic desensitization, which was developed by Dr. Joseph Wolpe to help people overcome their anxieties and phobias. In this method, clients learn relaxation techniques and are slowly introduced to the source of their fear and anxiety. The idea is to build comfort and to desensitize them to the source of their fear. Would you be surprised to learn that Francine Shapiro read a lot of Joseph Wolpe before starting her doctoral program? To be honest, EMDR would not be as controversial if it simply removed the bilateral stimulation altogether. But without that element, it also makes you wonder what EMDR is doing that's different at all. There's a quote from the psychologist Richard McNally that I think summarizes this pretty well. He said, What's effective in EMDR is not new. And what's new is not effective. So there you have it. At the end here, I just want to be really clear that I'm not against using EMDR. It does seem to work for some people, and it has the advantage of being straightforward and solution-focused. So from my perspective, if it helps somebody, then why would I deny them that? There's this belief among the community, both therapists and clients alike, that EMDR is a treatment that works for others when other techniques have failed. While this belief is problematic in certain ways, it also has been true for some people. To a certain degree, even if it's using the same base techniques that are tried elsewhere, if this unique approach works for a client, then go for it. I guess my hope is that EMDR research continues to improve and that we get to the point where institutions like EMDR have the confidence to let go of elements of the practice that don't have a therapeutic benefit. And I also hope that EMDR becomes more decentralized and accessible, because I feel like that's the only way that we'll get the answers that we need in an expedient manner. Oh, and I also want them to rein it in on their marketing claims. That's just absurd. Oh, and also, if you've got an experience with EMDR, or if you've got any thoughts of your own, leave them in the comments. And until next time, I'm Micah. Think about it.